Hello and welcome to the NCTV Canon 60D tutorial. Small little camera, but very powerful and has a lot of functions. So the first thing that I'll show you how to do is put the battery in case your battery's dead or if they just aren't in the camera. So it's under right here. There's a little lever that'll open this sliding door. So this is your battery, you'd slide it in, just follow the arrows, follow the shape, and do that, and then close it. You could run into a circumstance where this plate is like put in the bag like this, so it's going to be sideways. You just have to unscrew it a little bit, twist it, you know, get it as straight as you can, and then tighten it down with a key or a quarter or something like that, and then you have access to the battery. And then you just slide it onto your tripod here. You'll hear that snap, and then you need to tighten it down with this lever over here, but as you can see, it can hit the camera, so you kind of have to just work with it as best as you can. But once it's tightened down, it's not going to go anywhere. And there it is on the tripod. So let's turn it on and go through some of the functions. So here's the flip out screen. You can, you know, this is probably the best feature of the camera. You can turn it, if the sun's in the way, you can block it out, or if you want to see how you're framed, you can turn it around and it'll flip it around for you. The on switch is right here under this dial. You slide it over. It starts with something saying sensor cleaning, and it's on. The lens cap was on, so that's the first thing. And you want to make sure that it's set to movie mode. So it has all the same functions as a normal video camera do. It's just the way you get to them is a little bit backwards. So your exposure dial is right here to let more light in, more or less light in. And you'll see as I open it up, we can see the green screen, and then eventually it'll get white. So I'm just adjusting exposure by just turning this around. In DSLR cameras, the gain, which is artificial light if you're in a dark space, is actually called ISO, and that's the same as a still camera. That's why these DSLRs ride the line between a still and a video camera. So if you aren't getting enough light, if you open your exposure all the way, then you just press ISO, and it brings you to this menu, and you just scroll through until you have the appropriate amount of light. The general rule of thumb is get the lowest ISO that you can while still having your exposure bright enough that you can see the image. So what you would do is you open your exposure all the way up, then you set your ISO based on that. So open it all the way up. So on this lens it's to f-stop 2.8, then you press the ISO, then you'd slide around until you get the number you're looking for. So we'll just put it on 100 because that's the lowest, which means it'll be the best image quality that you can get. A mistake people make when they're adjusting exposure is that they'll start to adjust their shutter speed, and they'll see a difference in the camera. Like you'll all of a sudden get a lot more light, and they think that that's their exposure, but actually what they're doing is really messing with the record rate, the shutter speed. So if you spin this dial, but you're not on a menu item, it's going to change your shutter speed, and you can see it changing on the bottom left. And you don't want to do that unless it's motivated. If you really know that you want a certain shutter speed, then go for it and you know what you're doing. But if you don't, the general rule is that you want to double your frame rate. So because we're at 1080p, which is 1080 30 frames per second, we're going to do 60 for our shutter speed. So if we were recording at 720p with 60 frames per second, our shutter speed would then become 120. Although on this camera I think you can only do 125. So you do 125 shutter if you're doing 60 frames per second. So that's what I would recommend unless you know what you're doing. But yeah, so we want to make sure that remains at 60, and that any light changes that we're making are through the aperture or through our ISO. Everything is, all the main functions are controlled under this quick menu here, which is the Q in the square. And when you press that, you have this column of menu items over here, and so you can just scroll through using this, the middle of your exposure dial, and just pressing it like a directional pad. And so here you can change your resolution and your frame rate. So it's set to 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second. That's probably what you want, but if you're doing some, I don't know, high speed thing and you want to shoot in 60 frames per second, you'd have to go to 1280, 60. So you're losing resolution, but you're gaining the frame rate. So it can be worth it depending on the circumstance. But let's just put it back to 1920 by 1080. And then here under color temp is how we're going to set our white balance. So there's a bunch of presets here. You know, a sun for if you're outside in the daylight, shade, cloudy. You can use one of these if you're in one of these spots, but the way I like to do it is to put it onto the color temperature dial and have something white in front of you and kind of gauge it with your eye. But if you're choosing your own, you use the dial up top, which is illustrated by this. That picture equals this dial up top. 3200 is indoor tungsten lights, not fluorescents, but lamps and general halogen bulbs and tungsten. And then 4400 is typically where you want to be for fluorescence. It can go a little bit on either way, but if you set it to 44 and you're in fluorescence, it should be okay. And then if you're in a mixed color temperature area, you can do 4400 or 4800. Test them both and see what they look like. And then if you're outside and it's bright out, you can do 5600. Those are just general rules. You can use your eye and trust your eye. Whatever it looks like on your screen, it's going to look like on the computer screen. So don't want your image to look too yellow, don't want it to look too blue. So once you find that middle ground, then you're usually in the white balance that you're looking for. So that's that. And yeah, I mean, at that point for video, we're kind of ready to go. Here I have a 24mm prime lens hooked up to it, which is a wider lens. We also have a 50mm that you can put onto it. If you're doing interviews, I recommend the 50mm. If you're going to be walking around and shooting, just kind of on the go, I'd recommend this 24mm. And yeah, all your focusing is done on the lens itself. Use your eyes and try to get what looks best. With the wider lens, you have a little bit more grace. If you're using the 50mm, you have to be really exact because it has such a shallow depth of field that if you are soft on your focus, it's going to be very obvious. A really cool function that this camera has is these two magnifying glasses on the top right of the camera will give you an artificial push-in. So you can go 5 times in, 10 times in, and then that's the best way to get your focus because you're getting a really blown up version of what you're seeing. You make sure it's in focus. You're supposed to focus on people's eyes if you're filming people. And then you come out and then you're good. You don't want to move the camera at that point if you're caring about your focus. So I'm going to swap out the 24mm for a 50mm. So say I'm getting ready for a close-up of something or an interview. The first step when changing a lens is to turn the camera off. It has an emergency shut-off system when you do that. So if you forget to turn it off, it's not the end of the world, but you don't want light to flood your sensor. So we turn it off first and then put the cap on. And once it's on, the release for the lens is this button right here. So when you press this, it'll spin freely. Never force anything in video, but especially lenses, you don't want to crack the frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this button and I'm going to turn counterclockwise until it releases. And then, so now I have both the exposed sensor and the exposed lens. These are the two things we want to be cautious of. So I'm just going to temporarily put the lens cap on there to block the light. And then since I'm using this lens, I'm just going to use the same cap to replace it. So now my 24 is protected, and now I have my 50mm that I'm going to put on. There's a red dot here on the lens, and we're going to match that up to the red lens that's on the red dot that's on the camera here. So you just kind of match them up, then it'll slide in, and then you turn clockwise until you hear a little click, and then you're good. So put your other lens somewhere safe, and you're ready to shoot. There are big advantages to using a DSLR camera, and there are disadvantages to using them. The advantages are that you can change your lenses, so you can really plan your shots, and it also has a more cinematic look than if you're using just a regular video camera. So for professionalism, it's a really good option, and it's small. Small form factor is always a plus. You can kind of take it places that you can't take a big bulky camera. But the huge disadvantage is that it doesn't record professional audio. It has an internal mic in it, but it's really bad. So there's no XLR to plug your microphone into. Like I'm using a microphone here and it's plugged into the camera that we're recording on, but you can't do that with this camera. So in order to fix that, you have to use an audio recorder. So typically whenever you borrow this camera, unless you're going to just shoot video purely with no audio, then we'd send you that, but we'll usually always give you this with it. So this has two XLR jacks on the bottom of it, and it is what it says it is. It records the audio for you, and then later on you sync it to your video. So it's just an extra step, and it gets a little bulky, you know, if you need to have this on your body with this, but the results are usually worth it. So here's the zoom. You just turn it on here. It'll load up. You plug them in, and then you press record twice. And you'll see time code run across, and you'll see a record icon. And make sure that you're on inputs 1 and 2, because those are going to be your external mic inputs. And yeah, so once you press record twice, you'll see it recording. You can even listen to it if you plug your headphones in. Make sure you're getting sound. And then you just let it go. These can hold a really large amount of audio, so typically you just, as soon as you start shooting, you start it, do all your shoots. You can go for hours, and then when you're done, stop it, and then you'll just sync the audio in post. And Zooms also take, or the H4n also takes SD cards. It slides in right here. Just do it this way until it clicks in, and you're good. So it'll take a while, and it'll read the card, and then you're good. So everything that gets recorded onto this camera is recorded to SD cards, and the slot for the SD card is right here. And then you press it in once and it releases it. So everything goes onto this tiny little card. And these cards hold a ton of information as well. The one thing you do have to keep in mind with this camera is that it has a 15-minute record limit, sometimes less, can be like 10 or 12 minutes, and then it'll just shut itself off. So it won't shut itself, it'll stop itself from recording. So you always want to keep an eye and make sure that your camera's still recording if you're recording longer form things. So you just slide it in, press it in, it clicks in, and then shuts. That's another thing you want to do with your camera off, but it does have emergency shutdown. So if you do that when the camera's on, it'll just close itself down and then start itself back up once you put it in. If everything's good, lighting's good, you got your sound rolling, you got your focus, you press record right here. and you get this little red dot up here. If you press the info button, you can get more information while you're recording, just in case you want to know what your various ISO and aperture and all that stuff is at. Hopefully this has been helpful for you, how to learn the Canon XA10. It's a great camera, and we have 2 of them, so you could do a 2-camera shoot if you needed to. I hope this was helpful, number 1, and good shooting out there. Let's go. This has been the tutorial for the Canon 60D DSLR camera, and hopefully it helped you, and good luck shooting.